You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Today, in our ongoing Civics for Grown-Ups series, we're going to try to demystify the United States Senate. Listen, folks, this is no simple task. Relatively few specifics are outlined in the Constitution for the Senate's duties, but the rules, the regulations, the precedents, the traditions, and the in-practice exceptions are as numerous as a Cecil B. DeMille cast of thousands. The Senate is of particular importance, not only because, of course, it is, as it's been called, the greatest deliberative body in the world, some question about that, but because we have impeachment coming up again on reruns. So today, since we have no guest, we're going to split Inside the Headlines into two parts, because the Senate is really a thing. And then we'll proceed on into the surrealism corner with, of course, fighting words holding up the end, the caboose. Now, I hope you'll find some of these arcane, complicated, ridiculous practices of the Senate as hilarious as I do, especially considering that they are in deadly earnest. So let's just do it. Go inside part one of the headlines. To trace the history of the Senate would be to write the history of the United States, which would require volumes and is, of course, impossible here. That was a quote from Senator Henry Cabot Lodge in 1921, and of course he was quite right. The framers of the Constitution created the United States Senate to protect the rights of individual states and to safeguard minority opinion in a system of government designed to give greater power to the national government. There are 50 U.S. states currently. There are 100 senators, 2 to each state, not proportionally represented. Originally, the legislature of each state decided who their senators would be. After 1913, the people of the state chose their senators by vote. The Constitution provides specific functions for the Senate to check and balance other powers in the federal government. For example, the Senate may advise and consent to some of the President's government appointments, members of the Cabinet, heads of most federal executive agencies, ambassadors, justices of the Supreme Court, and other federal judges. And it must ratify all treaties with foreign governments, try all impeachments, and elect the vice president in the event no person gets a majority of the electoral votes. The Constitution does provide that the president may make an appointment of an official during a congressional recess without the Senate's advice and consent, but the office becomes vacant again at the end of the next congressional session. The annual salary of each senator since 2009 is $174,000. The president pro tempore and party leaders receive $193,400. In June of 2003, at least 40 senators were millionaires. In 2018, over 50 senators were millionaires. According to the Convention of Senate Seniority, the senator with the longest tenure in each state is known as the senior senator, the other is the junior senator. This convention has no official significance. Surprise? Though seniority generally is a factor in the selection of physical offices and in party caucuses' assignment of committees. It's sort of an exercise in kabuki. The Senate maintains a Senate calendar and an executive calendar. The former identifies bills and resolutions awaiting floor actions. The latter, executive resolutions, treaties, and nominations reported out by Senate committees, about which more later, and awaiting floor action. Both are updated each day the Senate is in session. The Senate Majority Leader and Minority Leader serve as spokespersons for their party's position on issues. The Majority Leader schedules the daily legislative program and fashions the unanimous consent agreements that govern the time for debate. These two also serve as the Senate spokespersons for their respective political parties and manage the legislative and executive business of the Senate. They are each elected by the senators of their party sessions or caucuses. The Republicans call theirs the Republican Conference. The Democrats call theirs the Democratic Caucus. By Senate precedent, here we go with the precedents, the presiding officer gives the Majority Leader priority to speak on the Senate floor. The Assistant Majority and Assistant Minority Leaders of the United States Senate, commonly called whips, are the second-ranking members of each party's leadership. Their main function is to gather votes of their respective parties on major issues. If there's no floor leader present, the whip may become the acting floor leader. Under the Constitution, the Vice President serves as President of the Senate. She may vote in the Senate, ex officio, for Vice Presidents aren't elected members, in the case of a tie, but she's not required to. For much of the nation's history, the task of presiding over Senate sessions was one of the Vice President's principal duties, the other being to receive from the states the tally of electoral ballots cast for President and Vice President, and to open the certificates in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives so that the total votes could be counted. This, of course, was the process taking place when the siege occurred on January 6th. Since the 1950s, vice presidents have presided over mostly ceremonial occasions, such as swearing in new senators, joint sessions, or at times to announce the result of significant legislation or nomination when a tie vote on an important issue is anticipated. The Constitution authorizes the Senate to elect a president pro tempore, Latin for president for a time, who presides over the chamber in the vice president's absence and is, by custom, the senator of the majority party with the longest record of continuous service. You still with me? The president pro tempore typically delegates presiding to a majority party senator, who presides usually in blocks of 1 hour on a rotating basis. The Senate has other officers who aren't members. The chief administrative officer is Secretary of the Senate, who maintains public records, disperses salaries, monitors the acquisitions of supplies, and oversees clerks. The assistant secretary aids the secretary. Another official, you'll remember this one, is the sergeant at arms, who maintains, try not to laugh, order and security. The Capitol Police, oh yes, well, handle routine police work, with the sergeant at arms primarily responsible for general oversight. Other employees include the chaplain, about whom more later, and pages, who are appointed. Sessions are generally open to the public and broadcast live on C-SPAN 2. Now here we get really kabuki. The Senate uses standing rules for operation. Senate procedure depends not only on the actual rules, but on a vast repertoire of customs and traditions, ironclad ones. For example, a hold is placed when the leader's office is notified that a senator intends to object to a request for unanimous consent from the Senate to consider or pass a measure. The Senate commonly waives some of its stricter rules by unanimous consent agreements negotiated beforehand by party leaders. A hold may be placed for any reason and can be lifted by a senator at any time. A senator may place a hold simply to review a bill, negotiate changes to it, or kill the bill. A bill can be held for as long as the senator who objects to the bill wishes to block its consideration. Holds can be overcome, but require time-consuming procedures such as filing cloture. We'll get to that. Holds are considered private communications between a senator and the leader and are sometimes referred to as secret holds. The Constitution provides that a majority of the Senate constitute a quorum to do business. Under Senate rules and customs, a quorum is always assumed present, unless a quorum call demonstrates otherwise. A senator may request a quorum call. A clerk then calls the roll of the Senate and notes present members. In practice, quorum calls are generally used to delay proceedings while waiting for a senator to reach the floor or to give leaders time to negotiate. Bills may be introduced in either chamber, but the Constitution's origination clause provides that all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. As a result, the Senate has no power to initiate bills imposing taxes. Furthermore, the House of Representatives holds that the Senate does not have the power to originate appropriation bills or bills authorizing expenditure of federal funds. The Senate has always disputed this. However, get this, when the Senate originates an appropriations bill, the House simply refuses to consider it, thereby settling the dispute in practice. Now, if that's not kabuki theater, I don't know what is. The approval of both houses is required for any bill, including a revenue bill, to become law. Both houses must pass the same version of the bill. If there are differences, they may be resolved by exchanging amendments or by a conference committee with members of both bodies. Debate is governed by internal rules. More rules, but not necessarily official ones. Senators may speak only if called upon by the presiding officer, but the presiding officer is required to recognize the first senator who rises to speak. Thus, the presiding officer has little control over the debate. The majority leader and minority leader are given priority during debates, even if another senator rises first. All speeches must be addressed to the presiding officer, who is addressed as Mr. President or Madam President, and other members must be referred to in the third person by state or position, using forms such as the senior senator from California or the lady from Virginia. Apart from rules governing civility, there are few restrictions on the content of speeches. There is no requirement that speeches pertain to the matter before the Senate. I could talk about the color of my sweater. Kabuki. The rules of the Senate provide that no senator may make more than 2 speeches on a motion or bill on the same legislative day, which begins when the Senate convenes and ends with adjournment, hence does not necessarily coincide with the calendar day. Kabuki. The length of these speeches is not limited by the rules. Thus, in most cases, senators may speak for as long as they please. Often, the Senate adopts unanimous consent agreements imposing time limits. In other cases, for example, for the budget process, limits are imposed by statute. However, the right to unlimited debate is generally preserved. It's time for our first short break, but do not wander away, because if you drop a thread in the Senate, you may never be able to find your way back. Oh my God. Coming right up, the Senate Part 2, Inside the Headlines Part 2, with the filibuster. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
And we're back with the Senate, Part 2. Don't worry, there's not 375 parts to the Senate, although there could be, but not on this program. Okay, the filibuster. Now, we were talking about debate, you remember? Well, the filibuster is a tactic used to defeat bills and motions by prolonging debate indefinitely. The term filibuster, from a Dutch word meaning pirate, became popular in the 1850s when it was applied to efforts to hold the Senate floor in order to prevent a vote on a bill. A filibuster can entail long speeches, dilatory motions, and an extensive series of proposed amendments. In current practice, the threat of filibuster is much more important than its use. Almost any motion that doesn't have the support of 3/5 of the Senate effectively fails. This means that 41 senators can make a filibuster happen. Now, historically, cloture has rarely been invoked because bipartisan support is usually necessary to obtain the required supermajority, so a bill that already has bipartisan support is rarely subject to threats of filibuster. However, motions for cloture have increased significantly in recent years. In the early years of Congress, representatives as well as senators could filibuster, but as the House of Representatives grew in number, revisions to the House rules limited debate. In 1917, senators adopted Rule 22, allowing the Senate to end a debate with a 2/3 majority vote, a device known as, you guessed it, cloture. It was first put to the test in 1919 when the Senate invoked it to end a filibuster against the Treaty of Versailles. But filibusters remained an effective means to block legislation, since a 2/3 vote is very difficult to obtain. They were particularly useful, filibusters were, to Southern senators, who sought to block civil rights legislation, including anti-lynching legislation, until cloture was finally invoked after a 60-day filibuster against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1975, the Senate reduced the number of votes required for cloture from 2/3 to 3/5, or 60 of the current 100 senators. Now, we're all familiar with the idealistic filibuster conducted by actor Jimmy Stewart in Frank Capra's classic film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but there have been infamous filibusters in the real-life Senate. The record for the longest individual speech goes to South Carolina's Strom Thurmond, who filibustered for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. If the Senate does invoke cloture, debate does not necessarily end immediately, even then. It's limited to up to 30 additional hours unless increased by another 3/5 vote. Certain circumstances provide for a process called reconciliation, by which Congress can pass bills related to the budget without those bills being subject to a filibuster. This is accomplished by limiting all Senate floor debate to 20 hours. When debate concludes, the motion's put to a vote, often voice vote, but a senator may request a recorded vote. The request may be granted only if it is seconded by 1/5 of the senators present. In practice, however, there it is again, senators second requests for recorded votes as a matter of courtesy. Senators not in the chamber when their name was called may still cast a vote so long as voting remains open, a minimum of 15 minutes. If the vote is tied, the vice president is entitled to cast that tie-breaking vote. If the vice president is not present, the motion fails. The Senate uses committees and subcommittees for various purposes, including review of bills and oversight of the executive branch. Formally, the whole Senate appoints committee members. In practice, however, the choice of members is made by the political parties. Generally, each party honors the preferences of individual senators by tradition, giving priority based on seniority. Isn't this crazy? Most committee work is performed by 16 standing committees, each of which has jurisdiction over a field such as finance or foreign relations. Each standing committee may consider, amend, and report bills that fall under its jurisdiction, and each considers presidential nominations to offices related to its jurisdiction. The Judiciary Committee, for example, considers nominees for judgeships, and the Foreign Relations Committee nominees for the Department of State, etc. Committees may block nominees and impede bills from reaching the Senate floor. Standing committees oversee departments and agencies of the executive branch and have the power to hold hearings and to subpoena witnesses and evidence. Subpoena power is a mighty cudgel when employed. The appointment of standing committees permitted the Senate to assign long-term studies and investigations to those panels in addition to regular legislative duties, and this was a decisive moment in the Senate history. Whereas the Senate previously set the agenda, the committees came to be, in effect, the Senate's agenda maker. Over time, the role of Congress has broadened from merely informing itself to informing the nation. In the landmark case McGrain v. Doherty, the Supreme Court firmly established a comprehensive reading of congressional investigative power, noting that a legislative body cannot legislate in the absence of information, and that, quote, some means of compulsion are essential to obtain what is needed. Approximately 1/4 of all Senate committee hearings relate to oversight of executive agency operations. In most instances, standing committees serve as the Senate's principal investigative arm. But the Senate has also entrusted this responsibility to certain special and select committees, such as the Select Committee on Ethics. The Watergate Committee was a special committee. The Congress includes joint committees as well, members from both the Senate and the House. They have less power. They oversee independent government bodies, for instance, the Library of Congress. Until the second half of the 19th century, Senate committees operated without either clerical or professional staff. Wow. Today, approximately 1,000 professional and clerical staff work in Senate committees. Each Senate committee and subcommittee is presided over by a chair. Chairs control the committee's agenda, decide how much time to devote to the consideration of a bill, act with the power of the committee in disproving or delaying a bill or a nomination by the president, and manage consideration of bills that the committee reports out on the Senate floor. This last role was particularly important in mid-century, when floor amendments were thought not collegial. They also have considerable influence, do chairs. Senators who cooperate with their committee chairs are likely to accomplish more good for their states than those who don't. The Senate rules and customs were largely reformed in the 1970s, and committee chairs today have slightly less power and are generally more collegial in exercising it. The spokesperson for the minority party is known in most cases as the ranking member, but in the Select Committee on Intelligence and the Select Committee on Ethics, the senior minority member is known as the vice chair. Why, you may ask? Kabuki. Until the mid-19th century, the Senate made committee appointments by vote of the full body or the decision of its presiding officer. The first method proved wildly time-consuming. The second incited much dissatisfaction. In 1846, members agreed both political parties would submit for the full body's approval a slate of members to fill committee seats. The new plan fostered the development of Senate party caucuses. Party caucuses now convene before each new Congress to elect leaders and determine committee assignments. Caucus rules provide for each new elected senator to choose a committee assignment before any other newly elected member is allowed to make a second choice. New senators make selections via a system that gives first choice to those who previously served in the Senate, then those with prior House service, and last those who served as their state's governor. All other new members choose by random drawing. Bite me. Traditionally, the majority party member with the greatest seniority, which we will remember is a myth, serves as chair. Senate critics argue that the current system is broken due to partisan paralysis and suffocating rules. For instance, the filibuster is frequently debated. The Constitution specifies a 50% threshold to pass legislation, and many feel the de facto 3/5 threshold for general legislation prevents beneficial laws from passing. The so-called nuclear option was exercised by both parties in the 2010s to eliminate the filibuster for confirmations. Supporters of the filibuster think it's a protection for minority views, a check against single-party rule, particularly when one party holds the presidency and House and Senate majorities. Yet representation in the Senate itself is not proportional to population. It skews toward minority rule. Small states are disproportionately European American, so African Americans have only 75% of their proportionate voting power in the Senate. Latinx Americans just 55%. The 4 million Americans with no Senate representation in the District of Columbia and U.S. territories are heavily African and Latinx descent. Admitting Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states, particularly since both have more residents than the smallest states, would reduce this inequity. In 1870, Hiram Revels, a Republican from Mississippi, became the first African American to ever serve in the United States Senate during the brief hour of Reconstruction. 5 years later, Blanche K. Bruce, that was a man, of Mississippi, took the oath of office. It would be nearly another century, 1967, before Edward Brooke of Massachusetts followed. Carol Moseley Braun broke new ground in 1993, becoming the first African-American woman to serve. In 2021, Raphael Warnock of Georgia won a runoff election, bringing the total of African-American senators today to 11 out of 100. For its first 130 years, the Senate was entirely male. The first woman senator was Rebecca Latimer Felton of Georgia, appointed for a single day in 1922. Margaret Chase Smith was the first woman to serve in both the House and then in the Senate beginning in 1949. In 1978, Nancy Kassebaum of Kansas was the first woman elected to a full term without her husband having previously served in Congress. The tokenism changed after the 1992 Hill-Thomas hearings. In addition to Barbara Mikulski, re-elected, 4 women were elected: Washington State's Patty Murray, Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois, and Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, both of California. Bathrooms for women on the Senate chamber level were first provided as late as 1992. Women weren't allowed to wear pants until 1993, when Mikulski and Moseley Braun did so in defiance. As of January 2021, there are 24 women, 16 Democrats and 8 Republicans serving, out of 100 senators. Time for another quick break as we wend our way through the labyrinthine rules and Alice in Wonderland regulations of the United States Senate. But coming right up is the Surrealism Corner, as if, she said, we hadn't already been in it. The Women's Media Center founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
If we find ourselves in the United States Senate chamber, we must be in the surrealism corner. The Senate has always worn a cool, civilized veneer to cover its somewhat savage body. In the early drawings, quite a few spittoons are visible by the desks. Let's glance at some of the other surreal aspects of the Senate. We can start with the chaplain. Now, the chaplain of the Senate is chosen to, quote, perform some ceremonial, symbolic, and pastoral duties. These responsibilities include opening Senate sessions with a prayer or coordinating the delivery of the prayer by guest chaplains recommended by members of the Senate. In 1948, Wilmina Rowland Smith became the first female guest chaplain to deliver the opening prayer. In 1992, Warith Deen Muhammad was the first Muslim. In 2007, Rajan Zed was the first Hindu, although his prayers got interrupted by protesters who rushed the podium. And in 2014, Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, was the first Buddhist. Many of these people have been interrupted by Christian fundamentalists. The chaplain's prayer is referred to as one of the Senate's most enduring traditions in the official Senate pamphlet, Traditions of the U.S. Senate. The chaplainship itself has always been held by a Christian. The chaplain has a staff that includes a chief of staff, director of communications, and executive assistant, and works with a volunteer liaison in each Senate office. While the annual salary for the first Senate chaplains was $500, the salary is now set as a level 4 position in the executive schedule, which is $155,500 in 2011. The total annual budget for the office, including salaries and expenses, is $415,000 as of 2011. It's probably gone up now. The inclusion of a prayer before the opening of each session of both the House and the Senate traces its origins back to the days of the Continental Congress and the official recommendation, Tisk, tisk, bad Ben, of Benjamin Franklin. June 28, 1787. Quote, I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. Period. Close quote. Of course, he probably had Quakers in mind. That at least would have been different. Unlike the chaplain of the United States House of Representatives, who must be elected to a 2-year term at the beginning of each Congress, the Senate chaplain, like other Senate officers, does not have to be reelected. Both the House and Senate chaplains are elected as individuals, not, quote, as representatives of any religious body or denominational entity, period, close quote. Oh, no, no, no. Yet, I repeat, always been a Christian. The question of the constitutionality of the position of the Senate chaplain, as well as that of the House chaplain, and at times that of military chaplains as well, has been a subject of study and debate over the centuries. Opponents argue that it violates the separation of church and state, and proponents have argued, among other factors, that the same early legislators who wrote the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights, from which the position of, quote, non-establishment and church and state separation is derived were the same ones who approved and appointed the chaplains. Except that that's a lie. Totally not true. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, guys, James Madison, in his detached memoranda writings, believed the positions simply could not ever be justified. Quote, "Is the appointment of chaplains to the two houses of Congress consistent with the Constitution and with the pure principle of religious freedom? In strictness, the answer on both points must be in the negative. The Constitution of the U.S. forbids anything like the establishment of a national religion. The establishment of the chaplainship to Congress is a palpable violation of equal rights, as well as of constitutional principles." You go, Jim Madison. "The tenets of the chaplains," he continues, "elected by the majority, shut the door of worship against the members whose creeds and consciences forbid a participation in that of the majority. To say nothing of other sects, this is the case with that of Roman Catholics and Quakers, who have always had members in one or both of the legislative branches. Could a Catholic clergyman ever hope to be appointed a chaplain? Not unless he's a guest. To say that his religious principles are obnoxious, or that his sect is small, is to lift the evil at once and exhibit in its naked deformity the doctrine that religious truth is to be tested by numbers, or that the major sects have a right to govern the minor." Close quote. Jim, I could not agree more. Petitions to abolish the chaplainship in both the Senate and House were submitted as early as the 1850s, but went nowhere. Then, unfortunately, the constitutionality of legislative chaplains was upheld in 1983 in Marsh v. Chambers by the Supreme Court. The court noted that the custom is deeply embedded in the history and tradition of this country and has become part of the fabric of our society. You could say the same thing for sexism and racism. Here's another surreal one on a different subject. On May 22, 1856, 2 days after Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts concluded his rousing anti-slavery speech, Representative Preston Brooks found him seated at his desk in the Senate. Quote, "I have read your speech," Brooks declared as he raised his heavy walking stick. "It is a libel on South Carolina," Brooks added, then repeatedly struck Sumner about the head and shoulders in what has become known as the caning of Sumner, who was left bleeding and unconscious on the Senate floor. Sumner could return only intermittently over the next 3 years because of his injuries. He resumed full-time duties only in 1859. But he became a trailblazing legislator in abolition and then civil rights, as well as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he would exercise great influence. To gain Senate approval of what would become the 13th Amendment, Sumner collaborated with a number of anti-slavery activists and forged a unique alliance with members of the Women's National Loyal League. Created by stalwart reformers Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the Women's National Loyal League held its first convention in May of 1863 and began a campaign to collect 1 million signatures on a petition demanding a constitutional amendment for the total abolition of slavery. To receive this and other petitions, Sumner asked the Senate to create a special committee to take into consideration all propositions concerning slavery. The Senate complied and named Sumner as chair. By early 1864, the National Loyal League had collected 100,000 signatures. On February 9, 1864, Sumner presented the petitions to the Senate, calling the signers a mighty army, 100,000 strong. They ask for nothing less than universal emancipation. His speech became known as the Prayer of 100,000. That month, he introduced a constitutional amendment to end slavery, asking that it be referred to his Select Committee on Slavery and Freedmen, although Senate practice dictated otherwise. Judiciary Committee Chair Lyman Trumbull objected, insisting that his committee was the proper one. When the Judiciary Committee reported its version of an abolition amendment to the full Senate, Sumner thought it not strong enough. He had insisted that any amendment must include a provision that all persons were equal before the law, but few senators were ready to take such a bold step. Making all persons equal before the law, argued one senator, might lead to dangerous consequences, such as providing voting rights for women. Instead, the committee approved more modest language that echoed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." Close quote. The statement was less than Sumner had hoped for, but he joined his colleagues in voting for passage of the 13th Amendment in April of 1864. In 1870, Sumner introduced what he considered to be his most important piece of legislation, a civil rights bill to guarantee to all citizens, regardless of color, equal and impartial enjoyment of any accommodation, advantage, facility, or privilege. He had characterized segregation and other anti-black laws in the South as nothing but the tail of slavery, and he predicted his civil rights bill would be the greatest achievement of Reconstruction. Dying, Sumner pleaded with Frederick Douglass at his bedside, "Don't let the bill fail. You must take care of my civil rights bill." When raised again, an amended version of his bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. It would take another 80 years for his ideas to gain legislative endorsement, and even then, now, in minimal ways. And here are some very short-take guffaws from committee members displaying their ignorance with enormous surreal pride. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican, South Carolina, seeking to discover if Facebook is a monopoly, asked Mark Zuckerberg, "Is Twitter the same as what you do?" It overlaps with a portion of what we do," Zuckerberg answered. Same committee, but this time the question is from Utah Republican Senator Orrin Hatch. "How do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?" Zuckerberg blinked for a moment. He couldn't believe it either. And then he said, Senator, we run ads." "Oh, I see. That's great," Hatch responded. Senator Ted Cruz, everybody's favorite senator, seized the Senate floor to draw attention to a cause. Some people say it wasn't really a filibuster because he couldn't stop the legislation before him technically. It was funding the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. He did talk for an impressive 12 hours. To fill it, Cruz veered off topic every once in a while. He chatted to no one in particular about how much he likes White Castle burgers, Ashton Kutcher, Duck Dynasty, the shower scene in Psycho, and doing Darth Vader impressions. From the ridiculous to the sublime, as in dealing with senators who have trouble acknowledging our recent fair and free election. The Senate may expel a senator by a 2/3 vote. 15 senators have been expelled in the Senate's history, William Blount for treason in 1797, and 14 in 1861 and 1862 for supporting the Confederate secession. Although no senator has been expelled since 1862, many have chosen to resign when faced with expulsion proceedings. For example, Bob Packwood in 1995 for serial sexual harassment. The Senate has also censured and condemned senators. Censure requires only a simple majority and does not remove a senator from office. Some senators have opted to withdraw from their re-election races rather than face certain censure or expulsion, such as Robert Torricelli in 2002. And that was just for corruption, which barely qualifies these days as surreal. Time for our final break now, but I'll be back directly with some fighting words.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, it's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Talk radio with a brain.
Words of satire can be fighting words. Here's a quote for you. The Senate is a sanctuary, a citadel of law, of order, and of liberty. And it is here in this exalted refuge, here, if anywhere, will resistance be made to the storms of political frenzy and the silent arts of corruption. And if the Constitution be destined ever to perish by the sacrilegious hands of the demagogue or the usurper, which God avert, its expiring agonies will be witnesses on this floor. Those words were spoken in his farewell speech in 1805 by Vice President Aaron Burr. Now, it's true that later on he was accused of treason, but he was Vice President to Jefferson. And in 1872, the following probably apocryphal story began to circulate. There's a tradition that Jefferson, coming home from France, where he was ambassador, called Washington to account at the breakfast table for having agreed to a second, so Jefferson thought, unnecessary legislative chamber. In actuality, we know that Jefferson wanted two chambers. "Why," asked Washington, "did you just now pour that coffee into your saucer before drinking it?" "To cool it," answered Jefferson. "My throat is not made of brass." "Even so," rejoined Washington, "we pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it." Well, I'm not so sure that the Senate has been a cooling factor. Look, it's both easy and very difficult to make fun of the United States Senate. Easy because its procedures are, in fact, convoluted, deliberately understated, baroque, and thus manipulative, exceedingly non-transparent, one might say opaque, and in some cases really farcical. Certainly many senators are farcical, I mean. But difficult because, well, if not the greatest deliberative body in the world, it certainly qualifies as one of them. It stumbles and falls and bashes its face, but it does try. During its tenure, we have grown, matured, become more human in a good sense. It has seen some great individual people, like Sumner, along with the scoundrels. It deserves reform. It cries out for modernization. And let's face it, when the day does come that we express concern over the token numbers of straight white elderly males in the U.S. Senate because all the people of color, mostly women, grace those chambers, that will be a very good day indeed. Those are my fighting words, Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag Fighting Words. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor Regina K. Scully, WMC president and co-executive producer of this program Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.